Imagine this: one man, sitting in a gilded palace, surrounded by gold, jewels, and advisors, unknowingly holding in his hands the fate of millions. One careless decision, one reckless gamble, and the world's economy collapses around him, not over decades, not over years, but suddenly. Shockingly, like a house of cards falling in a storm. You might think it was a reckless banker or a modern-day financial institution. You might assume it was the dot-com bubble or 2008's Wall Street collapse. But the truth is far stranger. This catastrophe happened centuries ago, and it wasn't caused by Wall Street brokers or greedy corporations. It was triggered by a king. A single monarch whose ambitions, vanity, and miscalculations sent shockwaves through economies across continents. How could one king, in an age before complex stock markets, global trade agreements, or digital finance, bring the world economy to its knees? The answer lies in history, hidden accounts, and the mistakes of power unchecked by reason. And today, we are uncovering the story that textbooks barely mention, but one that shaped the economic patterns we still see today. To understand the disaster, we must first step back to the world the king ruled. It was a time when monarchies dominated Europe and Asia. Power was concentrated in the hands of a few, and national wealth was measured largely in gold, silver, and land. Banks existed, but they were fragile, often little more than personal treasuries for nobles or merchants. Paper money was emerging, but trust in it was fragile. Governments were beginning to experiment with public debt. They borrowed from wealthy merchants and financiers to fund wars, palaces, and prestige projects. The stakes were enormous. Defaulting on a loan could bankrupt entire regions, cause riots, and undermine centuries of political stability. And yet, many rulers treated money like a personal plaything, assuming wealth was infinite and their authority unchallengeable. Enter our key figure, King X, a ruler of immense charisma, bold ideas, and an insatiable appetite for grandeur. On the surface, he was visionary. He modernized armies, built awe-inspiring palaces, and pursued trade deals that other nations could only dream of. But behind the pomp lay a dangerous combination: chronic overspending, reckless borrowing, and a lack of understanding about the interconnectedness of economies. Supporting him were advisors, some wise, some sycophantic, all constrained by the culture of obedience. Merchants, nobles, and financiers all tried to warn him. Some quietly profited from his schemes, others pleaded for caution. But in the end, the king believed his destiny was bigger than balance sheets. And that's the first twist most people miss. This wasn't just a story of greed, it was a story of misplaced trust, hubris, and systemic ignorance. The king didn't intend to destroy the world economy. He thought he was building it. The story begins with a seemingly simple ambition: to make his nation a global powerhouse. King X wanted to dominate trade routes, fund explorations, and establish colonies. All noble goals, except he lacked the capital. Gold reserves were limited, taxation was unpopular, and borrowing was politically risky, so he turned to the emerging financial networks of Europe. Private banks, merchant consortiums, and early stock exchanges became his playground. At first, it worked brilliantly. Loans funded trade missions, return profits flowed into the treasury, and the kingdom appeared unstoppable. But beneath this success, cracks were forming. The king began borrowing beyond his means, assuming that every new venture would pay for the previous one. Interest rates climbed, debts multiplied, and soon the kingdom owed more than its treasury could ever repay. Here's the crucial point: the king didn't see himself as indebted. He believed in the power of projection. If he acted rich, the world would treat him as rich. Merchants, lenders, and even rival nations were deceived by appearances, and appearances mattered because the economy at this time was largely psychological. Confidence in leadership, trust in currency, and belief in repayment dictated whether markets thrived or collapsed. At this stage, the king was riding a high. His nation was celebrated in trade journals, envoys from foreign courts praised his ambition, and investors lined up to lend. But behind the scenes, the empire's financial base was eroding. This is where the story begins to twist. Success was sowing the seeds of ruin. Encouraged by his early victories, King X embarked on increasingly audacious projects. He launched massive infrastructure programs: canals, roads, ports. He sponsored expeditions across oceans in search of wealth and resources. He subsidized industries with extravagant funds. To finance these ventures, He created complex financial instruments, bonds, promissory notes, and trade guarantees that were innovative for their time but poorly understood. They were marketed as safe, profitable investments. Merchants and investors trusted the king's reputation and poured capital into these schemes. At first, the returns justified the optimism. Trade expanded, new markets opened, and his name became synonymous with prosperity. But these profits were illusory. Many projects were speculative, some outright failures, and corruption was rampant. Funds intended for infrastructure sometimes vanished, redirected to personal estates or bribes. The king doubled down, believing that temporary setbacks could be offset by bold gambles. Each loan taken to cover earlier debts added pressure to maintain appearances. The financial system began to resemble a tower of cards, stable in calm times, but catastrophic in any shock. By this stage, historians looking back see a clear pattern: over-leverage, overconfidence, and systemic risk. Yet at the time, few saw the disaster coming. Markets were still blind to the fragility of the empire's finances. Merchants continued trading, foreign lenders continued funding, and the king continued spending. The first warning signs were subtle: delayed payments, minor bank defaults, rumors of underfunded projects. They were easily dismissed or covered up. The king's advisors tried to advise caution, but each cautionary note was met with confidence or anger. "We are destined for greatness," the king would declare, ignoring mounting evidence to the contrary. Meanwhile, the king's debt instruments had begun circulating beyond his borders. Lenders in distant cities, unaware of the kingdom's true financial health, held bonds and notes backed by promises the king increasingly could not honor. The potential for a global ripple effect was quietly accumulating. This is where the story's tension peaks. The stage is set. The king's decisions, compounded over decades, have created a fragile, overextended financial network. One shock, one bad harvest, one failed expedition, one foreign refusal to lend could ignite a catastrophe, and as history would show, that shock came sooner than anyone imagined. So how did a single king, acting with what seemed like confidence and vision, manage to crash the world economy? How did loans, bonds, and royal ambition converge to create chaos on a global scale? Everything the king had built, the towers of debt, the sprawling projects, the borrowed capital, was now teetering on the edge, and it took just one trigger. It started quietly: a failed trade expedition. Ships loaded with promised riches never returned, crops in distant colonies faltered, and then came the banks. Minor defaults at first, lenders unable to collect on notes, but soon panic spread. Investors across the kingdom and beyond began demanding repayment. Confidence crumbled. At this moment, King X realized that appearances were no longer enough. His treasury, once thought abundant, was empty. The loans he had taken to fund prior ventures now demanded payment all at once. Interest was compounding faster than revenue. Promises made decades earlier were suddenly unmanageable. And so, in a matter of weeks, the king's empire faced its financial breaking point. Merchants closed shops, artisans went unpaid, and the government struggled to fund armies. Currency devalued, trade contracts failed, and rumors of bankruptcy spread like wildfire. The fragile network of trust that had sustained the economy now unraveled. This was no minor recession. Entire cities experienced runs on cash, merchants defaulted, banks collapsed, and foreign creditors, previously confident, suddenly froze credit. Nations that had relied on trade with the king's empire felt the shock immediately. The collapse was contagious, a financial contagion centuries before the term globalization existed. The fallout was catastrophic. Economies tied to the king's empire through trade, debt, or investment plunged into crisis. Prices for basic goods skyrocketed. Starvation loomed in regions dependent on imported grain. Governments scrambled to stabilize markets, but centuries-old financial systems lacked tools for intervention. Foreign lenders demanded repayment, armies grew restless without funding, and political allies began questioning their allegiance. Riots erupted in capital cities. Nobles and merchants who once profited from the king's ventures now suffered devastating losses. Some families lost generations of wealth in months. Meanwhile, the king, facing humiliation and political pressure, attempted desperate measures. He minted new coins without backing, raised taxes dramatically, and forced creditors into unfavorable settlements, but these efforts only worsened the crisis. Confidence is the lifeblood of any economy, and trust, once broken, cannot be simply legislated or printed. By the time the dust settled, historians estimate that the collapse wiped out decades of economic progress across multiple regions. Entire trade networks were destroyed. Banks failed permanently. Political power shifted, with rivals seizing territories previously under the king's control. The king, like many rulers before and after him, believed that bold action could reverse fortune. He introduced sweeping reforms, new financial institutions, regulations, and public-private partnerships meant to stabilize the economy. But there was a critical flaw. These fixes were reactive, not preventive. They addressed symptoms: delayed payments, failing banks, currency devaluation rather than the root cause, systemic overleverage, and reckless expansion. In some cases, attempts at reform backfired. New taxes sparked rebellions. Emergency loans to failing banks created moral hazard, incentivizing further risk. Foreign investors, scarred by losses, refused to lend again. And the king's advisors, many of whom had survived the early crises by bending rules or hiding failures, were suddenly powerless. What's remarkable is that the king didn't see the disaster as systemic. He believed that one more gamble, a lucrative trade deal, one final expedition could restore the empire. History, however, would show that once confidence is destroyed, it takes days. Even today, global markets respond to rumors, speculation, and perception as much as fundamentals. One misstep, one failure of transparency, and entire regions can experience financial tremors. The lesson: human behavior in finance hasn't changed much over 500 years. Psychology, trust, and confidence remain just as critical as gold or paper currency. 1. Unchecked ambition is dangerous. Even the most visionary leaders can create systemic risk if ambition exceeds understanding. Expansion without limits often leads to collapse. 2. Confidence is the foundation of the economy. Money isn't just numbers. It's trust. Once confidence erodes, no law, decree, or coin can restore stability overnight. 3. History is a mirror, not a warning. Ignored patterns repeat. Overleveraging, risky speculation, and ignoring early warnings have caused crises across centuries, from monarchies to modern nations. The story of King X is more than history, it's a cautionary tale. Every time governments, corporations, or individuals overreach without understanding consequences, they risk repeating the same mistakes, and sometimes the world pays the price. So next time you read about a debt crisis, a stock market bubble, or government overreach, remember, the king who bankrupted the world didn't act maliciously. He acted with confidence, optimism, and ambition. And that is exactly what made the collapse so devastating and so timeless. If this story surprised you, hit that like button and share it, because history has lessons we can't afford to ignore. And if you want more deep dives into the most shocking financial disasters of history and the patterns that shape our modern economy, subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what we uncover next.